Hello, everybody. My name is Pete Bowers. I'm delighted to present this video. It's a second in a series on structured word inquiry and how we teach grapheme-phoneme correspondences in this instructional approach. In this video, I want to follow up on some questions raised from the first video and then consider some additional possible ways of teaching grapheme-phoneme correspondences in a structured word inquiry framework. Just so you know, you do not need to watch the other video first to watch this one. They can go in either order. This one, I do go into a little more detail and address some aspects of the research and such at the end. But mainly it's about just seeing some other ways, some ways that we teach grapheme-phoneme correspondences in structured word inquiry. So, and in particular, I want to be clear that in both the previous video and this video, the practices I'm showing can be done, some of them can be done before kids have learned all their letter names, let alone having learned many grapheme-phoneme correspondences, which is a question that many people ask about. Now, I want to clarify something from the previous video. In that one, I used the word cat as kind of a stereotypical example of a very first word we might be teaching kids who know really nothing about how to read and write. And in that video, I used unfortunate wording that caused confusion that I want to clarify now. So in that video, I used this sentence at one point and said, imagine that a kid is reading this sentence in a book and they get to this word and get stuck. And then I talk about ways I would teach the grapheme-phoneme correspondences of the word cat to get to that word. Now, the thing that caused confusion is by having said, if kids were reading and they got stuck, people took that, well, then this isn't beginning reading then. And so what I could have said, what I should have said to be more clear is I could be reading with a child who cannot read, who does not know the letter names, does not know grapheme-phoneme correspondences. I could read a book pointing along and get to this word and say, hey, let's take a look at this word cat. And then all of the instructional practices that I show in that other video apply the same. So the fact that I errantly said, imagine the kid is reading and gets stuck, the point is I can read with a child who can't read, and you could disagree or agree with the instructional strategies I show, but I'm arguing that they apply even if a kid cannot read at all. So just to clarify that, if you go watch that other video. Now, another thing that I did in that video that I just want to highlight here is I compared me reading this sentence, mom says she wants a chat, versus mom says she wants a cat. Of course, they differ by just that final word, and that final word only differs by one letter. But notice if I get to this word and I spell it out C-A-T to draw attention to those individual graphemes, it gets confused. That's totally appropriate. But if I hit the word chat, I would spell it C-H-A-T to highlight that CH working together as a team. And that's a thing that we're going to get into in this video as well. But just to when we just look at a word made up of single letter graphemes, spelling out doesn't signal that this practice of spelling out the graphemes inside the base. So I just wanted to highlight that as something to keep in mind that applies to this video too. Now, in that previous video, I wrote this little silly story as if it was a story that I'm reading with kids. And I highlighted the word cats and the word cat. And we talked about, hey, why did we say cats in there, but cat in the other place? And we see that, oh, if you say cat, you're talking about one cat that's shy and hiding versus many stray cats. And so we're introducing the idea of a base and things that you can fix at the end, suffixes like the S, and we can get into prefixes and such. That's what I started with there. But what I want to do now is start on a whole different possibility that from that first example, and then we'll come back to some of that other stuff. And that is the idea of homophones. I find homophones a particularly rich way to talk with kids about how the writing system works and how it represents the sense and meaning of words that they know in their oral language. We're trying to figure out how is that represented in this written language that they're just starting to work with. So here is one example of a way that I might do that. when I go, often when I work in schools, and I might work in a preschool class or a kindergarten class where some of the kids don't know their letter names, some know some of them, some know some grapheme-phoneme correspondences, some might be able to read, the same variety that every teacher deals with young kids. And so when I come in, I might be sitting on the carpet and say, come over here, kids, I can't hear you. And I've just planted this seed as the kids are gathering around, sitting on the carpet. I said, that sounds funny. I just said, come over here so that you're near me because I can't hear you. But those two words sound the same, but they're not the same, are they? And so we start talking about these ideas of words that can sound the same, but are unrelated. Do you know any other words like that? And so kids often actually do know some of these. And if they don't, I toss out some examples. Some favorites are I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream, which is a special kind of things sounding the same but being different. And then another classic is I went to the CCC to see what I could CCC. Notice how things that we associate working with kids already make use of homophones, because you don't need to be able to read to understand what a homophone is. You can get the joke without the written language. But it turns out when we look at the written language for it, we actually learn something really profound about how the writing system works. So if I say to the kids, well, let's talk about that. I went to the CCC to see what I could CCC. So when I talk about that sea, I'm talking about the ocean. So here's waves for the ocean. Now I'm just going to spell out the word sea for that sea. And the way that's spelled is S-E-A. And I'd get them maybe do it again, S-E-A. And now I'm naming the letters as I type them. And I might ask a kid, could you spell that out now? And they might go S-E-A, in which case I go, oh, very good. You named the letters exactly what are there, but I spell it a little differently. And that grabs kids' attention because I just told you these are the same letters, but I spell it differently. What's going on? So notice how I spelled it. I'm going to tap to show you. I spell it S-E-A. And I get everybody to try and tap it like that with me. And we go S-E-A, and we see that I've given one tap for the S and one tap for the E-A, and saying that E-A together. So why would I do that? Well, everybody, let's say the word see. So the kids say see. What do you feel at the beginning? You feel that S. How do you write that S in the word see with the S? And I've just told you the name of this letter S. So if this is new to you, you're just getting practice. But now say the word see. They say it again. Now say see without the S. What do you got? You have E. So how do we write that pronunciation E in this word see? And if we've just gone S-E-A, I find kids are very good at saying E-A. Now they just got the motor memory for saying E-A. These letters may be new to some of them or totally established for others, but all of them are getting the practice of the letter name S and the E and the A, but they're saying the E-A as a group to see that happens. Now, so this is the C for, I went to the C, but then I say to see what I can see. That's a different C. So here's glasses. I need glasses to see clearly. So this tells me that this C is for the ocean, the S-E-A version. But let's see how we spell the word see for I can see you. That one is spelled S-E-E. Everybody spell that with me. And I might write it out on the board again, S-E-E. And we now practice S-E-E and go through the same process. And we say, what do you feel at the beginning? We wrote that with that phoneme with the S again. Now say C without the S. We hear that E. Wait a second. How do we write that E that we hear at the end of this C? That's with that double E. So here we have a double E, but here we have an EA. Now, this is a key point. You don't need to be able to read, and you don't need to know the letter names in order to see that this word is not spelled the same as that word. And we can look at this word and make sure we see that's an A letter. That's different than the E here. So they are not spelled the same. And for those just learning letter names, good practice distinguishing the letters and the letter names. And now I can say, well, wait a second. These words sound exactly the same. Why do you suppose they're spelled differently? And what I find, young kids without hesitation say things like, because they're different words, because it would be confusing if they were spelled the same. And so when you introduce words in this way, kids have the intuition that it makes sense that these words are spelled differently, and that actually represents what can be described as the homophone principle, which states wherever two words can be pronounced the same, wherever possible, they're spelled differently to signal that difference. And so now we've established this idea, and the irony is that when I work with schools and I ask for teachers to give me examples of irregular English spellings, homophones are always on the list of spelling being crazy. In fact, the fact that homophones are typically spelled different is actually a part of how the system operates. And one of the things it means is that we're planting a seed here for, and how much we talk about it is another question, is it's a good thing we have more than one way to write that pronunciation E, otherwise we couldn't distinguish these different words with different spellings. So that's just one option of something that we can do with homophones. Now, if I go back to the text from that previous video, we talked about cat and cats there, but there's another word that I wanted to take advantage of here that I planted, which is the word play. So it's lovely to see cats and dogs play together nicely. So putting it in that sentence to make sure kids know, so the dog and the cats play together nicely. Oh, you guys were playing nicely at recess today. The cats like to play together like the kids like to play together. Just making sure everybody knows the vocabulary. Could have a second language kid who doesn't actually know the word play yet, and we got to make sure we have the meaning established before we dive in. All right, so I want to look at this word more carefully and maybe ask the kids to spell it out. They might not know the letter names. They might. But if somebody does know the letter names, it might go P-L-A-Y, in which case I say, excellent, you named those letters exactly right, but I'm going to spell it differently again. Let's see if you can catch it. I spell it P-L-A-Y. And again, everybody do that. P-L-A-Y, we do together. We're practicing the letter names, but again, they notice that I'm giving one tap for the A-Y. And why am I doing, but the P and the L get single taps. So again, we use that to work through the phonology and this of the base. So we say play, what do you feel at the beginning? P. That P is written with the P. Then you say, what do you feel after the P, pull? Oh, you feel that L, the tip of your tongue is topping the top of your mouth. Then you're saying L, that's written with the L. And now say play, what do you feel at the end? A, how do you write that A in play? That A that you hear with an AY. So again, we're signaling that the P and the L don't work together like the A and the Y. And we're going to learn about the AY is a single structure. So one thing we've learned is that sometimes you find a single letter acting like a grapheme representing a phoneme. Sometimes you have more than one letter working together. And that's something that we'll get into the terminology and studying more as we go. So what is a possible next step? Once we've established the grapheme-phoneme correspondences in our base, and we know what it means because we're talking about dogs and cats playing together and them playing together nicely and at recess and all that. Well, one thing is we can make what's called a word web, where we collect words of the same base. And this is a way so we can guide kids to think of words related to this word play. And one thing that does is going to address vocabulary and morphological knowledge while we're studying words related in meaning and structure to a base that children are now familiar with. So I've made sure you're familiar with the word play. I've already planted the word playing a little while ago when I said, were you playing outside? We're talking about cats and dogs play. You guys were playing nicely. So we're establishing both the morphology and the vocabulary. But the other thing that a lot of people miss is that it provides this context for repeated, explicit practice with the letter names and the names of graphemes that we just introduced in this base. So by spelling out P-L-A-Y over and over again, which you will do in this activity, we get in practice with the letter names and the names of the graphemes. So this is an activity I use all the time. I often called the what's in the family game. This is really activity I've kind of evolved from work with Lynn Anderson and Fiona Hamilton, who both have amazing websites. I recommend you check out their websites, all sorts of resources for this kind of work with young kids and older kids. But here we are. So the way that this game works is that we're saying, okay, there's a kind of a central metaphor that I want to introduce the kids to. So one of the stories here is that, well, it turns out that words come in families just like people come in families. And this way we're talking about something that young kids know about well, which is the idea of families. They know what parents and kids are, and sisters and brothers and siblings, and this idea of an immediate family. And we can talk about extended families like grandmas and grandpas and uncles and aunts and nieces and stuff. Right now we're talking about an example of word families that act like people families. There's something, it's a comparison that I want to make. And this allows us to work with something that kids already have good knowledge of, what a family is, and build on it by talking about how words act in a kind of a similar way. So here in this, we're going to call this a little bag, and the kids are going to, we're sitting at the whiteboard, they're sitting on the carpet, and the kid can put their hand in the bag and pull out a word. And what we're going to do is we're going to see which of the words in my word bag share the base, P-L-A-Y. And in order to be in the family, they have to have the same name, the same family name, the name P-L-A-Y. And so we have to share spelling, but we also have to check that they have the same meaning if they're in the same family. So I'll show you how the game works. So I have a kid come up. They do not need to be able to read to come and pull a word out of the bag. And so my first suggestion to them isn't to read the word. What I'm going to say is, could you spell that word for me? Now, we've practiced the P-L-A-Y, so they might be able to do that even if they weren't before. Maybe they don't know these words, maybe they do, and spelling out is a good way to find out. But if they don't, I say, oh, so we have a P-L-A-Y again, but now we've got an F-U-L. And I get to say F-U-L. So if you, I saw you outside playing with the kittens earlier. They were very playful kittens. So we can fix that full at the end of play and get playful. We added the S suffix to cat to make cats. We can also add the FUL to make playful. So I'm going to put that word over here, and we can see that it has the spelling of the base and it has the same kind of meaning. Being playful means you're playing. All right. So when another kid comes up and puts their hand in and they pull out this word played, they spell it first. If they can read it, great. If they can't, I read it for them. And if they can't spell it, I spell it for them. P-L-A-Y. E-D, get everybody that? P-L-A-Y, E-D, and notice how I don't tap in the suffix. And that's something that is a practice that I'm going to start establishing. So I do it from the start. I'm only tapping in the base where I tap the graphemes. The suffixes like FUL and ED, we're going to get into the habit of spelling quickly as a group. All of these are ways of building orthographic representations in your mind that helps to get better quality of those representations and helping the process of learning to read and write. So here's the word played, like I played soccer yesterday. Okay, so I played soccer. You can talk about I painted my door, and you can start fixing EDs at the end of other things. Now, we'll do another one before I just open all of them up. So playmate. So a kid comes now again, they don't have to read it, but they can spell it P-L-A-Y. What's this? And if they don't know the letters, so it's P-L-A-Y. And then I have M-A-T-E. Now, this is very subtle, and I'm not expecting the kids to notice, but maybe you did. Notice how I tapped all the way through. That's because I didn't add a suffix, I added another base. So now I get to say, this is a playmate. So a playmate is like your mate, your friend that you play with. So you might have your playmate come over to have a play date at your house. So playmate, when I said played, I put my two fingers after here. Play is the base, and then I have my suffix played, and then I can spell it, the P-L-A-Y and the E-D, or the P-L-A-Y and the F-U-L. But here I took P-L-A-Y and I added an M-A-T-E. This is a compound. It has more than one base. And so I'm introducing this idea. Again, we have the spelling of the base and we have the meaning. It's just that we have it with another base. So now we have it there. Now, just for time, I'm going to move all of these back and we'll just work through these words a little quickly. So here we get, he plays soccer. I might put that over here. Notice that we could talk about the phonology of the S in play, plays. Oh, I said Z, but I add that S. Yeah. And then here's the word day. It doesn't actually have the full spelling, does it? D-A-Y. This is like the day of the week. That's a different meaning, and it doesn't have the spelling. So day, it might sound the same at the end, but it's not the same word. It's not in the family. To be in the family, you have to share the spelling and the meaning of that base P-L-A-Y. And now someone pulls this one out. Oh, we spell that one P-L-A-Y H-O-U-S-E. And again, I've signaled it's a compound playhouse. You may have a playhouse back at your house that you play with your playmate. Here's a different one. We notice when we have the kids spell this one out, wait a second, everybody else, when they took their word, they started with P-L-A-Y, but this one we had to start with the R-E. So we've had suffixes, but now we've got a prefix. We can fix an RE before a base. So a replay is kind of like, if you think of when you see the buzzer beater at the end of the basketball game, as soon as it goes in right with the buzzer, what do they do afterwards? They show the replay. They play it again. And so now we can talk about, I could redo my work. I could retie my shoes. So we're bringing attention to those meaning structures all the time, spelling them and spelling the affixes, prefixes, or suffixes, prefixes or suffixes quickly as a group. Now we have the word plane, P-L-A-N-E, all single letter graphemes. And now we might say, wait a second, I hear play when I say plane, but it doesn't have the P-L-A-Y, and a plane is like an airplane. It's not the same as playing, so it doesn't belong, even though it kind of sounds similar. And then we have playing that I might add into this pile. So we've got a little family of words, and we're spelling out the structure of the base over and over, which is great practice. We're getting single letter graphemes, digraphs like the AY, and before we got the double E and the EA, and we're just always addressing meaning. We might go ahead and take our this is now on the wall. If we wanted to, we could even color code the bases to highlight them. And then what often I recommend, and you usually don't even have to recommend it because the kids have the idea, that why don't we leave that up for the week? And now for the rest of the week, I want you out there seeing if you can find more words that belong in this family of the base. And what's the name of the base? P-L-A-Y. I'm going to get the kids into the habit of spelling any base, prefix, or suffix for multiple reasons, one of which is just to get to practice with naming the letters and the graphemes. All right. So we have this, so now you can start to look for other words. And now kids are going to be thinking about these written words outside of class with their parents, and they're excited when they come in and they get to add ones. And sometimes they suggest ones that don't belong, in which case we do the same spelling and meaning test and we find out if they belong or they don't. So that's just another quick introduction to another one of many possibilities about early instruction. So if we ask this question, how does SWI address instruction about grapheme-phoneme correspondences? I hope you see that this is explicit instruction. I'm being explicit all the way through, but it structures our inquiry into learning not only what are the grapheme-phoneme correspondences, we're starting to understand how they work. So we noticed that we needed different spellings of C and C to show their different words. So we learned about the EA and the double E, both being able to write the same pronunciation. It's not a bug, it's a feature. So we're giving the kids the sense that the spelling system makes sense. This is from the very beginning of formal instruction, where that grapheme-phoneme correspondence knowledge is so important. And the other thing is, this spelling out practice just gives this regular ongoing practice that is happening all the time. And it includes this use of motor memory cues to build familiarity with single letter graphemes, digraphs, and trigraphs. So lots of practice, multi-sensory, all that. The other thing that we can do is integrate common digraphs, trigraphs, and affixes into our lessons for script. So when we write, we usually don't write single letters, are usually combined with other letters in graphemes and in morphemes. So if that is something that you are curious about, Rebecca Lovelace has a great website and she does wonderful instruction with script. So if you're already going to teach how to kids to form the letters, why not teach an effective motor pathway for these? And if we're spelling out, if we practice our script, why not practice it in EAs and double E's and IGHs and UGHs and CHs and THs, these common letter groups announcing as you get the motor movements down, another way of building letter names and grapheme names and morpheme names in your mind. And it's all guided by teachers' awareness of morphological and etymological influences and how they constrain and explain grapheme-phoneme choice, which is something we're going to keep diving in. So just for a kind of a window on some of how this looks in class, I mentioned my friend Fiona Hamilton at WordTorque. Here's some stuff from her Twitter feed that I find has so many great illustrations. And she just had images of a class she was working with. And you can see all the ways that the kids are boxing bases, circling graphemes. I think in there we have a TH, I, and K for the word think. Over here, we see our word PLAY with the graphemes circled and the base box. And there's the ING signals of the vowel letters there. All over the place, all sorts of great stuff. Kids being engaged both in teaching what are the graphemes and the morphemes in the words they're working at. And another one here that if you find this one in that lovely video with the kids spelling out TRASH. So you can see what this looks like in schools. Now, another story that I wanted to share, you can find this link. There's a post on Real Spellers where in the introduction, it is actually the main post is about an inquiry we did into discovering all the jobs for this final non-syllabic E, what many people call the single silent E, whatever you call it. There's actually many jobs for it. And if we don't know different jobs for it, we keep thinking there's these exceptions. And so there's a very great story there of working with this young student. But before I even get to that story, I tell another story about working with him that is very relevant to what we're talking about right now. And that is when I started working with Charlie, he was in grade 1, late fall, and very unhappy because he was getting nowhere in reading and writing, and he's a bright kid, and he just wasn't feeling good about everything with reading being such an issue. And so I started working with him, and as I was working with him, I took a book that I figured he would enjoy. Just as from what I understood about him, he seemed like a bright kid and humor, like funny stuff. And Phantom Tollbooth is a super great book with lots of wordplay, great messages and stuff that I taught in grade 4 all the time. Now, notice I'm picking a book that you might read in grade 4 with a kid who can't read. Well, that's because I'm not asking him to read. I read the story with him. And then, like I described with the cat story, I just pick a word. Once we've got our head inside the story, we're enjoying the story. And then I just pick certain words that I think might be useful to investigate. And so I picked my first word, and probably a word with an ing suffix. And when I got to it, I say, when you spell that word for me? And that's how I discovered he doesn't know all his letter names. He's actually probably naming, I discovered afterwards that his teacher would describe him as naming letters accurately about 60 or 70% of the time. So, but I find that out right away because whenever I work with kids, they're going to be spelling words out. And so he didn't recognize the I. And so I spelled it for him. So let's say the word was jumping. So I spell it JUMPING and ask him to spell it with me. He's getting practice with that letter, the I that he missed the first time. And we go ahead and do that. But then I say, that also gave us the whole premise to talk about, wait, jumping, you have jump and you're adding that ing, the JUMP and the ING. And so I introduced the concept that every word you meet is either going to be a base or a base with something fixed to it. And I often point out, like, in the real world, here's a base for my lamp. So usually in the world, if you have a base, you build on top of it. Your globe has a base and your globe's up in the air. But in words, it's different. We have a base and we build in front and we build after. And so we just found an ing that's built after our base JUMP before the word jump, so jumping. I bet you, Charlie, says I, that if we read a little ways, you're going to see some more. So I want you to keep an eye out. And if you see an ing, you let me know. And certainly it didn't take another sentence or two until we run into a word with an ing. He said, there's one. And we look at it, we interrogate it, we find out, yes, in fact, that word has an ing we can remove and end up with a base that makes sense. And so again, we're always tying the identifying of these orthographic structures to meaning. And now he's on this path of identifying a structure like an ing. And now we can find eds and fuls and other suffixes. And then we start finding prefixes. And similarly in the base, we are now spelling out the graphemes like I model. I'll show you an example of that. But for example, we did start to build a morpheme chart with the suffixes that he started to find. So here, and we might look at a matrix for a word like this, and we just talked about play, so I have some examples there. And so I started to add suffixes to our morpheme chart that we had encountered. And then I say to Charlie, well, you know what, you're getting so good at finding these morphemes. When you're reading with your mom, why don't you keep an eye out for them and your mom, and then you can add to your morpheme chart at home. And then when we meet, we can see if they work or not. And Charlie loves doing this. And so he's always adding to his morpheme chart at home. And then one day, I'm guessing somewhere about, well, before we get to that, let me give you an illustration of the reading with him. So this is another book that we got into later, Dr. Peanut by Alan Venable, that I can't recommend highly enough. Every kid I've worked with this just loves the book, super fun. And actually there's a whole word play in it that kind of has a morphological component in an interesting way that is exactly the thing that grabbed Charlie's interest at the beginning. You'll see in a second. So here we have a Dr. Peanut. So he's a peanut who's a pediatrician, as we're going to discover. But imagine I'm reading this. I read to Charlie, get ready to meet the smallest doctor in the world. Get set to meet Dr. Peanut. He is waiting for you to say hello. And here's Dr. Peanut. Wait, look how tiny he is. Wait a second, I might say. Did you catch a word with an ing there? And if he didn't, I can point to it, but there's that word. So could you spell that one? W-A-I. And now, after a while, he would do things like this. A-I, because we started to find AIs. And so this is what, when you do it this way, your focus, he starts to catch them even after he spells them. So we have waiting. So there's another example. And we could go through, as we read again, I'm reading, and I might ask him to pick a word to get into. But if I say, can you find another word with an ing, I'll read out loud. You keep your eye out. That is a greeting a peanut would understand. There, and he finds it. And if he spells this Greeting, very good. I would spell it Greeting. And in peanut, it's going to come up all the time. We get an EA that you're spelling. And that was the thing that I would notice all the time. If he's spelling out a word, and for example, this one, we had to work at the trigraph IGH. So, and you obviously couldn't read it. So he might dive into the nearest bush if he gets scared of these giants, which are people, of course. So that was the word might, Charlie. Say might. What do you feel at the beginning? How do you write that in might with the M? What do you feel at the end of might? With the T. Well, what's in the letter? In the middle, you have an IGH. Actually, it's M-I-G-H-T, and that IGH is writing that pronunciation here, the I. Might. Very good. So when that's the world you live in, when we're spelling out, he's getting so much practice all the time. And that's just see the process that's happening. And then maybe in our fourth session, one day we were reading and we find a word with a suffix that many people don't know about. I think it was the double E was the one that we ran into, and maybe a word like employee or refugee or something. And so once we worked out that it's a digraph, this or a suffix, this double E, I said, well, Charlie, I bet you don't have that on your chart. So he runs over to his morpheme charts. Mom, we got another one. And he puts his sticky note to add double E to the suffixes. And when he gets there, he says to me, Pete, look at all the morphemes I got, or all the suffixes. I can't remember what he said. But what he does then, of course, when he names them, and he had about 20 of them by the time we got there, he's naming them ION, URE, IVE, S, ES, ANT, naming them quickly as a group, exactly like we've been practicing all the time. And he gets to the end of the list, and he's all proud, which is lovely. And afterwards, I talk to the mom and I say, have you noticed the complete transformation in Charlie's ability to name letters? And the point that I'm making here is, what did I do that helped him make this hugely important transformation to being able to name letters confidently? It was that I integrated morphology into our instruction, the spelling of morphemes. That was the first thing that he could get his head around. It was a structure that was big enough that he could see and recognize, and it was a meaning structure, so we could find it and test the meaning. And that's what got him going and gave him his first real experiences of a success. And that was what got him to pay close attention to the letters and the letter names and the grapheme names and the morpheme names. I didn't say, uh-oh, he can't name those letters anymore, so we better go back and do flashcards with letters, because that's abstract and wasn't interesting him. He got to the letter naming because it was in service of something he understood. So if you're interested, you can see that whole story at that link. So let's talk about some common misunderstandings and misrepresentations about SWI in social networks and in the published research. So here's some assertions that just aren't true. One that is out there on occasion is that structured word inquiry does not teach grapheme-phoneme correspondences at all, which is clearly an absurd assertion given the video you just saw, but also a 5-minute Google search would bring up all sorts of examples of grapheme-phoneme correspondence in SWI. In fact, in the very first paper that introduced the phrase in 2010, my paper talks about spelling out loud specifically to teach grapheme-phoneme correspondences. However, here's a quote from a peer-reviewed journal making the argument otherwise. And so, as Buckingham points out, students are encouraged to spell words out using letter names rather than sound them out using GPCs. This contradicts any claim SWI teaches grapheme-phoneme correspondences. Simply not true. And the irony is the spelling out that she's referring to is one of the ways that I teach grapheme-phoneme correspondences. Unfortunately, when we asked the journal, would you print a correction for this demonstrably untrue statement, they just declined. So if you're interested in that, there's a link here to an article that I addressed that and a whole bunch of other things about orthography and the place in the research. So that's not true. Another common claim is that SWI recommends teaching morphology before phonology, which is also not true. It's not a claim I'm making, nor a claim that I've heard others say, because what we're talking about is teaching them together at the same time. As you saw with the examples I gave, we were teaching both grapheme-phoneme correspondences and morphology at the same time. My brother Jeff Bowers and I, it's claimed, have made strong conclusions that SWI is more effective than phonics or other forms of instruction. That's actually not true either. What we've been saying is there's lots of evidence that we should be studying it. There's not enough study about it. I'll let you freeze and read this quote from our 2017 paper, but I'll just point out a few things now that hopefully you've already read and froze. But we agree caution is warranted about what claims can be made. But there's strong theoretical motivations, and that's our goal, to motivate future empirical studies of SWI to test whether it is more effective. So we're not claiming that it's more effective, we're claiming we should be testing this instruction. Now, let's take a look here too. This is the thing that I wish people were recognizing, I guess, that structured word inquiry actually offers a hypothesis of a novel way to teach grapheme-phoneme correspondences, and we should test that. What do I mean by that? Well, one thing to keep in mind is I have yet to see any published definition of phonics instruction that references the role of morphology or etymology on grapheme choice. That is explicitly what we do in structured word inquiry. If it's not in the definition of phonics, then it's something that's different. And that means we have a difference that we should test the effect of. I know, yes, many people teach phonics and teach morphology, and that's great. If you're teaching phonics, I'm glad you're also teaching morphology. But SWI proposes something qualitatively different. And that is the idea that I want to test the effect of teaching the interrelationship of morphology and phonology in orthography. That is a different thing. When we teach phonics and we teach morphology separately, we still present many words as having irregular spellings that the kids need to memorize. So a word like does isn't explained in phonics instruction, and it's not explained in phonics instruction that also teaches morphology. The way to understand this is to teach the interrelationship of grapheme-phoneme correspondences and morphology, and then we can explain such spellings by looking at the interrelationship. So we have, of course, the base DO that builds the words do and does and doing, but we notice by using matrices and word sums that the pronunciation of this base changes, but the spelling stays the same. And that is a foundational aspect of how our whole writing system works. And I'll put a link below to a video of me teaching this family. But we also teach aspects of etymology that can explain spellings of things like homophones. We saw with C and C, just knowing that we should expect them to be spelling different is helpful and a way to focus on the EA and the double E digraph. But there's other homophones that give us other ways to talk about this. For example, come over here, I can't hear you, as I told you. Well, we can actually put these on the board and draw attention to the fact that, oh, the one for I hear you has the spelling of the thing with which I hear. That's a way of linking words connected in meaning with the same spelling. It's not about a prefix and a base. No, is a base, H-E-A-R is a base, but spellings have evolved to find ways to show these kinds of connections and distinctions between meaning. And if we take this word here, there, where, we can see they're all about place, and we can see that they're different, but because these are related, we can see, this H-E-R-E, those letters are also in these other words for place. And here we have another there, which is spelled differently. Their house is beautiful. They have a beautiful house. I wish I had a beautiful house like them. And if we look here, these ones that have to do with possession, we can see the common spelling here and even the IY connection. So there's, in this video, I can't show you all the things that we can do, but notice how these high frequency words that we're introducing here, we're not saying you got to memorize these kids, they don't make this because they don't make sense. We're presenting them in a way that makes sense and is attached to meaning and the structure and history of words. Without referencing morphology and etymology, children need to memorize which grapheme to use for a phoneme in a word when more than one is plausible. That has a serious issue for dyslexics who demonstrate that they don't have a strong orthographic memory. So we got to leverage their intellectual strengths or cognitive strengths to help them with something that they might not be as good at as others. And if we teach the interrelation, that allows us to triangulate the abstract grapheme-phoneme correspondences knowledge, grapheme correspondence knowledge, sorry for the typo, with meaningful morphological and etymological cues. Now, just to get a little bit more into the research, this is, you're used to probably seeing the reading triangle, not with the word morphology here, but the orthography, phonology, and semantics, that when we're trying to teach literacy, what we're trying to do is help people understand the links between the spellings, pronunciations, and the meanings of words, which is absolutely true. And this is an argument made in orthographic mapping, Perfetti's lexical quality hypothesis, the triangle model. I think it's so basic, everybody agrees. But one thing that John Kirby and I have pointed out is that the only part of the language system that has spellings, pronunciations, and meanings is morphology. You can't put syllables there or onsets and rhymes there because they don't convey meaning. The only part that ties to all 3 points of the triangle is morphology. And so what we present is the idea, building on Perfetti's lexical quality hypothesis, if 2007 is a good reference to that. If you understand that actually morphology can act as this binding constituent that integrates this information, creating better mental representations in your mind, which results in more automated access during reading. Same kind of thing that orthographic mapping and others are talking about. So another thing that I want to highlight is that structured word inquiry does not propose morphology first, but there is a common, because we're saying we want morphology at the same time as teaching phonology and etymology. There is a common phonology first hypothesis in the research that we see reflected with statements like this, that we believe that a focus on these morphological regularities is likely to be more appropriate in the later years of primary schooling, or we would predict that the benefits of explicit morphological instruction are more likely to be observed somewhat later in reading development. Notice these are statements of we believe or we predict, but in fact, if once we look at the research evidence, it turns out the research evidence we have about the instructional morphology points in the opposite direction. And we'll look at that in a second. But let's think about what would the empirical evidence need to look like to support this idea. And that would be, we would need evidence that including morphology from the start results in lower literacy gains compared to isolated phonics. And when I say isolated phonics, I mean the teaching of grapheme-phoneme correspondence in isolation of the role of morphology and etymology. Of course, you can teach isolated phonics and also teach morphology and reading comprehension strategies and other things, but it's isolated because the teaching of grapheme-phoneme correspondences isn't referencing morphology and etymology. So here we have meta-analyses, all of which were out before the previous statements that you just saw. And these are reviews and meta-analysis of the effect of morphological instruction. And what we see is that benefits everybody, but counter to what people have been assuming for a long time, the effects were better for the younger than the older, and better for the less able. So this is the opposite of what was being predicted. Now, it's useful to look at a couple of these details of this study. Gudrun and Anne, who did 2 of those meta-analyses, notice they found phonological outcomes had the greatest effect sizes in both meta-analyses. Morphological awareness had the second greatest effect. Let me show you what I mean. So what they mean, so here are the outcomes that they had. And if we look at them, the phonological outcomes were almost always greater than the morphological ones. The only case where that wasn't true was decoding for children with learning difficulties, but it was still positive, just not higher than the morphological. But so this is an issue that people are concerned. I understand why they're concerned that, wait a second, the phonology is so important. If we teach the morphology at the beginning, it loses time for learning the phonology. Well, this evidence doesn't point to that. This evidence points to that, wait a second, the greatest effect it offered was for phonology. And it's important to realize that this is in the presence of morphological instruction that rarely even talk explicitly about the interrelation. In our meta-analysis, we had 22 studies. I think it was 5 that even addressed that interrelationship at all. So even without being explicit about the relationship, teaching morphology had such a benefit for the phonology, which is, I don't think, what most people are expecting. I'll let you freeze and read what how Gudrun and Anne described their interpretation. So I'm assuming you've already read it, and just to highlight that synergistic relationship between phonology and morphology, and this idea, if that relationship exists, it makes sense to jumpstart this from an early age. Now, there's there's one more recent morphological intervention meta-analysis that I know of that targeted the effect of spelling for dyslexics. You can see that article here in Educational Psychologist, and I'll just report some of their findings. So, and here's an example. This title I find problematic: phonics first or morphology. Obviously, the implication is or morphology first, but that's not the message. It's morphology at the start. Anyways, we did not find that phonics instruction is more effective than morphological interventions in the early years or of formal literacy instruction or for more severe spelling deficits. So according to their meta-analysis, meta-regression analyses, it seems likely that phonics, morphological, and orthographic interventions are applicable across a wide age span. They were surprised at this, and they talked about some other qualitative thoughts, but then they just said, yeah, the meta-analysis that I just showed you confirms this finding. But here's, I think, a particularly striking one that again, I think people will be surprised by, even the authors. Against their hypothesis, the efficacy of phonics interventions decreased with increasing severity of the kid's deficit. It's hard to see that out of context, but that's what they're saying. The greater the spelling deficit a kid had, the less effective was their phonics instruction, whereas the efficacy of the orthographic and morphological interventions increased with the increasing severity of the spelling deficits the kids had. So I don't think most people would expect that the effect of phonics instruction decreases when kids have spelling deficits. That's not what the kind of the world that people normally think of. Now, it's important to note, they rightly point out it's a small data set, so it's not conclusive. It's not the end of the story, but all of the data seems to be pointing in the opposite direction that we expect, which I would think should grab a lot of attention is, wow, this is a potential way that we can improve our teaching of grapheme-phoneme correspondences and get the kids' phonological knowledge going. So, another reason I wanted to point to this research is that in social networks and stuff, I see people make claims that structured word inquiry just makes bizarre claims as if it's totally out of whack with what the research world says. And here I'm pointing you to the research that actually points to the fact that SWI seems like a logical direction to look. And just as a final evidence of that kind of research. I won't read this one, it's super long, but this is the final conclusion of a review on the effect not of morphological instruction, but morphological knowledge in the context of reading aloud across many languages. I'll let you freeze and read that. Again, notice major journal, major authors are writing this, and what we see is this idea that English is morphophonemic, maybe we should teach that. And the highlighting the point that English prioritizes consistent spelling of morphemes over consistent spelling of phonemes. And so that's the argument. Their findings are supporting that. But here's the thing I really wanted to highlight and bring back that story I was giving of Charlie. Importantly, poor readers of English often exhibit phonological processing deficits. So these children might benefit even more by teaching methods that focus on optimal grain sizes of the writing system, like morphemes. And I think that's what we saw with the story I gave of Charlie, because he was struggling, he was unmotivated, he was frustrated, he was feeling like it wasn't working. And whatever he did, he couldn't get a handle on anything, but it was actually finding suffixes that grabbed his attention to look inside words and to practice naming letters, let alone naming affixes and graphemes in the base. And so if I had followed the recommendations that we often see in the research, that you shouldn't do the morphology until some unspecified amount of grapheme-phoneme correspondences are learned, that would not have been a good route for Charlie. Now, that's anecdotal, of course, but I see this kind of stuff a lot, and the research evidence that we have is pointing in this direction. So I hope that this video does two things, at least, gives you a clear understanding of ways that we teach grapheme-phoneme correspondences in structured word inquiry, and this is just a touching on things in this video. Also clarifying the previous video that some people got confused by, but also just showing that this is actually what structured word inquiry actually offers a new way of teaching not only what are the grapheme-phoneme correspondences, which phonics does, but it does the new thing. It says, well, how do you know which grapheme to choose when more than one is possible? And to do that, you need to have something to triangulate with. And if we're triangulating with morphology and etymology, we're bringing meaning and structure into that study of grapheme-phoneme correspondences. And that's something that I think the research needs to take a look at. Cheers.